Look at what I'm standing in front of right now. A two-story mansion completely swallowed by the wild, the roof caved in at 3 different points, the windows empty like eye sockets staring at nothing, and vines crawling up the rotting wood walls like nature itself is trying to devour this place before anyone can figure out what happened here. At the edge of the property, rusting in waist-high grass, there's a car so old and so corroded that the only reason you can tell it was ever a car is the shape. The tires sank into the dirt years ago. The windshield turned to dust a long time before that. But that's not what's going to make you hold your breath. There are 11 abandoned cars on this property. 11. Some with the doors hanging open like the owner stepped out for a minute and never came back. Others with the hoods up, frozen in the middle of a repair that never got finished. There's a sedan from the 1950s with a tree growing straight through the roof. And at the far end of the lot, almost hidden by the trees, 2 airplanes. Not toy planes, not little crop dusters. Real, full-sized twin-engine aircraft with wingspans wide enough to make your brain stop working for a second. Who lived here? Why are there 11 cars and 2 planes sitting in the yard of a mansion that looks like it hasn't seen a living soul in decades? And what happened inside this place that made someone leave everything behind as if time just stopped and nobody ever came back to restart it? I'm going to answer all of that. But first, you need to understand how I ended up at this door, 18 years old, nowhere to sleep, and $16 in my pocket. I was 18 years old when the door of my own house closed in my face for the last time. It wasn't the gate of some stranger's property. It wasn't the entrance to a building I'd never been to before. It was the wooden door with the handle that stuck every winter. The one I had painted blue with my mother when I was 8 years old on a Saturday afternoon that I can still smell when I close my eyes. The smell of fresh paint. The smell of lemonade she had made and set in a plastic cup on the front step. The smell of wet earth because it had rained that morning. A perfect afternoon. One of those afternoons you store away without knowing you're storing it, because in that moment, you don't yet realize it's going to be the closest thing to perfection you'll know for a very long time. It was that door, and it was my mother who closed it. It took me years to understand what happened that night. Not because it was complicated to understand rationally. It was actually quite simple. Simple and cruel at the same time in the way that only things involving family manage to be. My mother's name was Lorraine. She had raised me alone since I was 3 when my father left and never looked back. For 11 years, it was just the 2 of us in that small house outside Baton Rouge. She worked double shifts at the hospital laundry. I learned to make my own meals by the time I was 7. We didn't have much, but we had a rhythm, a way of being together that didn't require a lot of words. She'd come home exhausted, and I'd have the kitchen cleaned and a plate covered with foil on the counter. She'd eat standing up, too tired to sit down, and sometimes she'd reach over and squeeze my hand once without saying anything. That was enough. For a long time, that was enough. Then Dale arrived. He moved in when I was 14. A tall man with a permanent frown, and hands that were always looking for something to fix, even when nothing was broken. He worked at a truck depot outside the city, and came home every evening smelling like diesel and irritation. I was never hostile with him, never rude, never disrespectful, never did what many kids do when a stranger walks into the space where a father should have been. I tried. I genuinely tried. But Dale never wanted my effort. He wanted the house, he wanted my mother, and I was a part of the package he simply hadn't ordered. For 4 years, the air in that house got heavier, the arguments more frequent, the looks colder, the meals eaten in a silence that weighed more than any fight. Dale had a way of making a room smaller just by walking into it. He'd sit in the living room with the television on, and the whole house would rearrange itself around him like gravity shifting toward a new center. My mother moved differently when he was home. Quieter, more careful. like someone navigating a room full of things that might break. And then on a Thursday night in December, he gave her the ultimatum. I heard everything from my bedroom with my ear almost pressed to the wall. His voice was flat and dry the way a man sounds when he's already made up his mind and is just going through the formality of announcing it. Either I leave or he leaves. I heard the silence that followed. It lasted much longer than I expected, much longer than it should have. And then I heard my mother say in a voice I have never been able to get out of my head, 2 words, okay. My mother used 2 words to decide my future. 2 words spoken in a voice so quiet they barely made it through the wall. But I heard them. I heard them the way you hear a bone break inside your own body, not loud, but unmistakable, and the sound stays with you long after the pain starts. The next morning, she called me into the living room. She sat on the edge of the sofa with her hands together in her lap, looking at a point somewhere between the floor and the window. She told me I needed to think about my future, that I was already 18, that it was time to be independent, that she would help however she could, but that the situation at home had become unsustainable. She didn't cry. She didn't hug me. She spoke like she was reading from a script someone else had written for her. Like the words had been rehearsed so many times overnight that all the feeling had been drained out of them, leaving only the structure, the shape of sentences that were supposed to sound reasonable but weren't. I had 1 week, 7 days to pack my things and find somewhere else to be. I spent those 7 days in a state of numbness that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I went to my part-time job at the grocery store. I came back. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling for hours at a time. I didn't cry during those days, not because I was strong, but because something inside me had switched into an emergency mode that didn't allow emotions. Only action, only survival, like a system shutting down everything non-essential to keep the core running. It was during those 7 days that I discovered something I wasn't supposed to hear. On the 5th night, I was in the hallway going to the bathroom when I heard Dale on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was low, but I caught enough. He was talking to someone, a friend maybe, or a relative, and he was saying that he knew I had a savings account, that I'd been putting money away from my job for almost 2 years. $2,400. He said Lorraine should ask me for it before I left. Call it rent. Call it contribution to the household. Call it whatever. The point was, I shouldn't be allowed to walk out with that money when I'd been living under their roof. I stood in that dark hallway with my bare feet on the cold floor and waited. And then I heard my mother's voice, not loud, not angry, just firm in a way I hadn't heard in years. No, that's hers. You're not touching it. Dale said something I couldn't make out. My mother repeated herself. I said no. That was it. No argument, no fight, no dramatic confrontation. Just my mother drawing one small line in the sand after failing to draw the one that mattered. She wouldn't fight to keep me in the house, but she would fight to let me keep my $2,400. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Because that moment didn't make things simpler, it made them infinitely more complicated. If she had been completely heartless, if she had agreed with Dale about the money, I could have walked away clean. I could have hated her purely and completely and used that hatred as fuel. But she wasn't completely heartless. She was something worse. She was weak. Weak in the specific way that breaks your heart because you can see the love still in there buried under layers of fear and dependency and the desperate need to not be alone. She chose Dale over me, but she didn't choose him entirely. She kept one small corner of herself where I still existed, and that corner was just big enough to make the whole thing unbearable. On the night of the 7th day, I packed my suitcase. It was green with small wheels, one of which had broken off years ago and we never fixed. I put inside everything that would fit. Some clothes, my documents. A notebook I'd been writing in since I was 15, the pages filled with thoughts I never shared with anyone. A phone charger with a frayed cable. A photograph of me with my grandmother who had died when I was 11. The only person in my life who had ever made me feel like I was exactly where I belonged. Nothing else. The rest stayed behind as if it had never been mine. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked to the front door. I stopped. I held the handle for a moment. The blue paint had chipped and faded over the years, but you could still see it if you knew where to look. I stood there holding that handle, waiting for her to appear in the hallway, waiting for her to say my name, waiting for anything. But nothing came. Just the sound of the television somewhere inside, and the smell of coffee that had soaked into the walls of that house over years and years. I closed the door behind me, picked up the suitcase, went down the front steps, through the gate, and I walked down the street without knowing exactly where I was going. It was night, December. A humid heat that stuck to the skin the way only Louisiana heat can, thick and heavy and close like the air itself is leaning on you. And I was 18 years old with a broken suitcase, $16 cash in my wallet, and absolutely nowhere to go. I had more in a savings account at the bank, but that night, walking down that street, $16 was what I could feel, what I could touch, what existed between me and nothing. I ended up at a bus stop 6 blocks from the house. I sat on the metal bench, put the suitcase between my feet, and stared at nothing for a length of time I couldn't measure. Buses came and went, doors opened and closed. People got on and off, moving through the night with the casual certainty of people who knew where they were headed. And I stayed there motionless, like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. I remember thinking many things that night. I thought about my grandmother, who would have been furious if she'd known what happened. She was a small woman with a voice that could fill a room, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. She would have driven to that house and knocked on the door and said things to Lorraine that would have made the walls shake, but she was gone. She'd been gone for 7 years, and the world she left behind had slowly rearranged itself into a shape she wouldn't have recognized. I thought about my high school English teacher, Mrs. Thibodeau, who had told me I had a talent for writing and that I should study journalism. She'd said it in front of the whole class, and I remember the feeling of being seen by someone who had no obligation to see me. That moment had stayed with me like a small light in a dark room, something I could look at when everything else felt shapeless. I thought about how I would never be able to afford college, how I was going to survive the next few days, how life sometimes feels like a trap that closes slowly, so slowly you don't notice until you're completely caught, and there's no way out. And then I thought something that surprised even me in that moment. I thought if I don't do something completely different right now, if I don't break some pattern, some logic, some obvious path, I'm going to disappear. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that makes the evening news, in a quiet way, an invisible way. I'm going to become one more person that life walked over and nobody noticed. That thought sat in my chest like a coal, and I carried it with me through the rest of that night. I slept on Bridget's couch. She was a co-worker from the grocery store, a woman in her 30s with 2 kids in an apartment that was already too small for 3 people, let alone 4. She let me in with the expression of someone doing a large favor and wanting to make sure I understood the scale of it. 3 days. That's what she gave me. 3 days to figure out my life. I worked my shift the next day like nothing had happened. Same thing the second day. I stacked shelves, ran the register, smiled at customers, said have a nice day 40 times, and carried inside me the strange weightlessness of a person who's been cut loose from everything that held them in place. I was floating and nobody around me could see it. On the 3rd day during my lunch break, I walked to a newsstand 2 blocks from the grocery store. It was the old kind, a metal kiosk run by an elderly man who sold newspapers and magazines and lottery tickets and never said much to anyone. I used to go there sometimes to flip through the classifieds and newspapers I couldn't afford to buy. The man never charged me for standing there. He never said a word about it. Just watched me browse while pretending to wait for someone who wasn't coming. It was there between ads for domestic work and rooms for rent and used furniture that I saw the listing that would change my life. But in that moment, in the exact instant my eyes landed on the text for the first time, I didn't know any of that. I just saw something strange. The ad was different from all the others, shorter, drier, and with a note at the end that no other listing had. Property for sale. Rural area 14 miles from town center. Large structure needs renovation. Price negotiable for reasonable offer. We do not answer questions about the history of the property. I read it 3 times. Then I took out my phone and searched for the address. Nothing useful. Searched the phone number. Nothing. Then I went into local Facebook groups for the area, typed in the address, and what came up made me stop breathing for several seconds. There was a photo, taken from far away with a bad camera, like the person who took it had been afraid to get any closer. And in the photo, in the middle of a property completely overtaken by tall grass and wild growth, was a mansion. Not a small house, not a modest cabin, a mansion. 2 stories, a stone facade, enormous windows with the glass broken out, a wrought iron gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, trees that had grown inside the structure, their branches reaching out through the windows like arms trying to escape. The upper portion of the roof had collapsed in at least 3 points. Plants were growing on what must have been the front gallery. But what left me speechless, what made my throat close in a way I didn't expect, was what I could see on the grounds. Because in that photo, even blurry and taken from a distance, you could clearly make out vehicles, many of them, too many to be normal, and at the far back, almost lost among the trees, 2 shapes that were definitely not cars. In the comment section below that photo, the entire town had an opinion. One person wrote that his grandfather said nobody could stay in that place for more than a week. Another wrote that it had been cursed since the 1960s and everyone knew it. Someone claimed that an entire family had disappeared inside and was never found. Another said the property had been condemned by the city and was going to be demolished soon. And there was one woman who had written in all capital letters, "Don't buy that place. For the love of God, don't buy that place." I read everything, every comment, every theory, every warning, and the more I read, the more I felt something strange happening in my chest. It wasn't fear, it was almost the opposite of fear. It was a kind of recognition, like when you see something for the first time and yet have the absurd sensation of having seen it before. I looked at that photo for a long time. And what I saw was not a haunted ruin. I saw a roof, 4 walls, a place that nobody else wanted, that nobody was going to fight me for, that nobody was going to throw me out of. I saw an opportunity that the entire world had discarded. I called the number the next morning early before my shift started. It rang for a long time. When someone answered, it was the voice of an old man. Tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep, but from years of carrying something heavy. He said hello in a way that made it clear he hadn't expected anyone to call. I asked about the property. He went quiet for a moment. Then he asked me if I had read the part of the listing that said they didn't answer questions about the property's history. I told him I had, that I wasn't calling about the history. I was calling because I needed a place to live and because I had everything I had saved in 2 years of part-time work, and that was everything I had in the world. Another long silence. Then he said, "Are you going to come see it in person before you decide?" I said yes. He said, "Then I'll meet you there tomorrow at 10 in the morning. If you get there and you still want to buy it after seeing it in person, the place is yours for whatever you've got." That night I told Bridget. She looked at me with an expression that mixed concern with the kind of pity you feel for someone who has clearly made a terrible decision, but who it's already too late to talk out of it. She said, "Are you insane?" I said, "Probably." And I went to sleep with my heart beating faster than it should have been, mixing fear with something I couldn't name yet, but that much later I recognized as hope. Hope is a strange thing when you've been running on empty. It doesn't feel like optimism. It doesn't feel bright or warm. It feels like a crack in a wall, a sliver of light coming through a place where there shouldn't be any light at all. And you don't know if what's on the other side is something good or something that's going to make everything worse, but you move toward it anyway, because staying in the dark isn't working anymore. The next morning at 9:30, I took 2 buses and walked a 1.5 miles down a dirt road until I reached the wrought iron gate I had seen in the photograph. In person, it was much bigger, much more imposing than I had imagined. Even with everything destroyed, the stone structure of the facade still had an extraordinary strength to it. The arches above the second-floor windows had an elegance that no modern house I had ever set foot in could match, even covered in moss, even with the cracks running from top to bottom, even with the vegetation that had invaded everything. That mansion had a presence that made me stop and stand there for a full minute before I could move. And then I saw the cars up close, and they were even more astonishing than the blurry photo had suggested. 11 automobiles spread across the property in various states of decay. A Ford from the 1940s completely covered in brick-colored rust, almost unrecognizable as a vehicle except for the silhouette. A Chevrolet from the 50s with the roof caved in from years of rain and vegetation. A cargo truck whose cabin had been colonized by a bush growing from the inside out through the shattered windshield. A European sports car that must have been beautiful once, now lying flat on the ground without wheels, resting on 4 mounds of dirt where the tires used to be. There were 3 vehicles I couldn't even identify by make or model because the rust and the plants had erased every distinguishing feature. And at the far end of the property, visible now from where I stood, the 2 airplanes. In person, they were even more disorienting. They were not small. These were real aircraft, the kind that carried passengers on regional routes with wingspans that made the entire scene impossible to process rationally. One was a twin engine with the paint completely peeled away and the propellers bent to one side like arms reaching for something they would never touch. The other had its fuselage covered in dark green moss, the landing gear wheels sunk to the axles in the soft earth like it had been trying to take off for decades, and the ground itself refused to let go. How had they gotten here? How do you land an airplane of that size on a private lot without anyone noticing, without anyone remembering, without any record? The old man arrived shortly after. He was thin with completely white hair, wearing an old jacket that looked like it had been elegant decades ago. He carried the gate key on a worn leather key ring. He opened the gate without ceremony and gestured for me to follow. We walked through what had once been a formal garden and was now a small jungle. He showed me the rooms in silence, like he was fulfilling a bureaucratic obligation and didn't want to be any more involved than necessary. A large living room with the ceiling partially collapsed in 3 spots, the plaster and wood hanging down in jagged shapes that the light came through in dusty beams. A kitchen with a cast iron stove still standing there with a pot on top, as if someone had walked out in the middle of making dinner and never come back. The pot was empty. It had been empty for a very long time. But the fact that it was still there, still sitting on that stove in exactly the position someone had left it, made my stomach tighten. 2 bathrooms on the ground floor completely taken over by mold. The tiles cracked, the mirrors so fogged with age that they reflected nothing. A wooden staircase that creaked on every step but held our weight. 3 bedrooms on the upper floor, 2 of them with the roof compromised. In one of them I could see the sky through a hole the size of a kitchen table, and a small tree had started growing in the corner where the rain came in its roots pushing through the floorboards. A library. Empty shelves of dark wood still intact, covered in dust and cobwebs so thick they looked like curtains. The shelves ran from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and you could see the faint outlines where books had once stood like shadows of objects that had been removed. At no point did he tell me anything about the history of the place. At no point did he explain who had lived there, what had happened, why it was like this. He showed me the rooms. He handed me the property documents in a yellowed plastic folder, and he said that if I wanted to close the deal, we could do it right there by hand, and he would have it notarized on Monday. I stood in the middle of that large living room with the sun coming through the glassless windows, hearing the wind cross through the structure from one side to the other, smelling the old wood and the damp earth, looking up at the broken ceiling that showed a piece of blue sky way up there. And I said, "I'll take it." He looked at me for a second. His expression was something I couldn't fully read at first. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to relief. Like he had been carrying a weight for a very long time, and someone had finally arrived to take it from his arms. His name was Mr. Pardo. I would learn much later that he was the grandson of the man who had built this place, that he had inherited it decades ago and had done nothing with it because the weight of what it contained was too much for him to carry and too much for him to let go. He had placed that ad in the classifieds like someone throwing a bottle into the ocean, not really believing anyone would find it, not really sure he wanted them to. We closed the deal right there. I went to the bank the next morning and withdrew every dollar from my savings account. $2,400. Everything I had saved in 2 years of bagging groceries and stacking shelves and working weekends and holidays while other kids my age were doing whatever kids my age do. I brought the cash back to the property that afternoon and put it in his hands. That $16 in my wallet the night I left home was all I had been able to touch in the moment. The rest had been sitting in an account, invisible, waiting. And now it was gone, traded for a set of keys and a piece of paper that said, "This ruin belonged to me." He gave me the keys. We signed the papers on a piece of plywood balanced on 2 sawhorses in the front gallery. Him with the pen he pulled from his jacket pocket. Me with a hand that was shaking so hard I had to press it against the wood to write my name. He left without looking back. He walked to his car, which was parked on the dirt road outside the gate, got in and drove away. I watched the dust rise behind his tires and settle back down, and then there was only silence. I stood in front of that mansion with the key in my hand for a long time. The afternoon sun was hitting the stone facade at an angle that made the moss glow a deep gold green. A bird was singing somewhere in the trees behind the house. The wind moved through the tall grass around the cars, making it sway in waves that looked like the property itself was breathing. I was 18 years old. I had just bought an abandoned mansion with 11 cars and 2 airplanes in the yard, using everything I possessed in the world. I had no electricity, no running water, no furniture, no food. Beyond what was left in my bag, no plan beyond standing right where I was standing. And no car either, which meant that getting to my job at the grocery store was going to require a 2-hour commute each way on buses that didn't run past 9 at night. But I would figure that out. I had figured out worse. And for the first time in 7 days, for the first time since I heard my mother say those 2 words through the bedroom wall, I felt something that wasn't numbness and wasn't fear and wasn't grief. I felt the weight of a key in my hand. My key. To my door. To a place that was mine in a way that nothing in my life had ever been mine before. Not given to me, not lent to me, not allowed to me on someone else's terms. Mine because I chose it. Mine because nobody else would. The first days were difficult in a way I wasn't fully prepared to face. I knew it was going to be hard. But there's a difference between knowing intellectually that something is going to be hard and living it in your body, on your skin, in the practice of every single hour. The first obstacle was the smell. The moment I opened the front door with my broken suitcase behind me, the smell hit me like a physical wall. Heavy mold, rotting wood, damp earth, and something else underneath all of that something I only managed to identify much later as the smell of time. The smell of what happens when a place stays closed inside itself for decades, accumulating everything that passed through it, holding everything and letting everything rot together in absolute silence. I spent the first night wrapped in a blanket I had brought in my suitcase, curled up in a corner of the living room that I had swept with a broom I found in a kitchen closet. Despite the December heat, I kept the blanket around me like a barrier between my body and everything else. I barely slept. Every sound the house made, every creak of wood, every noise the wind produced passing through the open windows woke me up. Not from fear of anything supernatural, from real concrete human fear. Fear that the ceiling would give way. Fear of some animal finding its way in. Fear of the absolute darkness because, of course, there was no electricity. On the second day, I woke up with the sun hitting me directly through the glassless window. I ate standing up in the kitchen with what little provisions I had left, and I started to work. I knew I couldn't afford a renovation. I had no money for that. What I could do was clean, organize, identify which parts of the structure were safe and which I needed to avoid. Create a minimum livable space where I could exist while I figured out what to do next. I spent the first days sweeping, removing debris, opening every window to let the air through, separating what was broken from what still worked. And I found things that surprised me. Heavy furniture made of solid wood that underneath all the dirt and the surface mold was still structurally intact. Pieces that someone had chosen with care decades ago that had survived the years through sheer quality of construction. A massive china cabinet in what must have been the dining room, with some of its glass doors still whole. A pendulum clock stopped on the wall of the library that, when I cleaned the mechanism, ticked for a brief moment before going silent again, like it had tried to wake up and couldn't quite manage it. I learned the space by living inside it. I learned which steps on the staircase not to trust. I learned that the back of the house had better structural integrity than the front, and that was where I should spend most of my time. I learned that in the afternoon, when the sun hit at just the right angle, the light that came through the upper floor windows was so beautiful it made me stop whatever I was doing just to watch. Golden light falling through dust and cobwebs, turning everything it touched into something that felt sacred. In those moments, standing alone in a ruin that everyone else was afraid of, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt like I was home, not because the place was comfortable. It wasn't. Not because it was safe. It wasn't that either. But because for the first time in my life I was standing in a space that asked nothing of me except to be there. That made no demands. That issued no ultimatums. That didn't need me to be smaller or quieter or less visible so that someone else could be more comfortable. The mansion just stood there, broken and open and patient, like it had been waiting for someone to walk in and start caring about it again. I worked out the commute to my grocery store job on the third day. 2 buses and a half-mile walk on each end, leaving the property before dawn, getting back after dark. It was exhausting in a way that made my bones ache, but it was necessary. I needed the income. I needed something to hold on to while the rest of my life was in free fall. So I kept the job, kept the routine, and spent every hour I wasn't at the store working on the mansion, cleaning and sorting and learning the shape of this enormous thing I had taken on. The commute became its own kind of meditation. In the mornings, walking through the dark along the dirt road with the stars still out, I'd think about the day ahead, the specific room I was going to tackle, the particular pile of debris I was going to clear. Giving myself small concrete objectives was the only way to keep the enormity of the situation from swallowing me. You don't renovate a mansion, you sweep one room, you clear one hallway, you test one section of floor, and then you do the next thing, and the next, and you don't look up at the whole picture because the whole picture will paralyze you. In the evenings, walking back from the bus stop in the growing dark, I'd sometimes stop at the gate and just look at the mansion for a moment before going in. The silhouette of it against the sky, the dark shapes of the vehicles scattered across the property, the faint outline of the planes at the far end. And I'd feel something that I can only describe as a conversation happening between the place and me, not in words, in something older than words, a kind of mutual acknowledgement. I was here. And it was here. And neither of us had anywhere else to go, and that was going to have to be enough. There were moments during those first days when doubt hit me like a physical force. Usually at night when I was lying in my corner of the living room listening to the house creak and settle around me, I'd think about Lorraine in her kitchen. I'd think about the blue door. I'd think about how I was an 18-year-old girl living alone in an abandoned building 14 miles from the nearest town, with no electricity and no running water and no real plan. And how from the outside that didn't look like courage. From the outside it looked like desperation wearing courage's clothes. But then the morning would come and the light would find its way in through the broken windows and I'd get up and start working again. Because the alternative to doing this was doing nothing. And doing nothing for a person in my position meant disappearing. And I had already decided that I was not going to disappear. On the third night, something happened that I didn't understand at the time, but that I've thought about many times since. I was lying in my corner of the living room almost asleep when I heard a sound that was different from the usual creaks and groans of the structure. It was a low, sustained hum, like a vibration traveling through the walls. It lasted for maybe 10 seconds and then stopped. I lay there in the dark with my heart racing, listening, but it didn't come again. The next morning I found the source. One of the old cast iron radiators in the hallway, a massive thing that hadn't functioned in decades, had been warmed by the afternoon sun, to a point where the metal expanded and the pipes connected to it, still anchored deep in the walls, had conducted that vibration through the entire structure. The house had literally hummed. The house had made a sound that traveled through stone and wood and plaster and found its way to the exact spot where I was lying. It wasn't supernatural. It was physics. But it felt like something more. It felt like the mansion acknowledging that someone was finally inside it again. That after decades of silence, there was a heartbeat in the building once more. I know how that sounds. I know. But I'm telling you what I felt, and I've learned that what you feel in a place like this is not always something that fits neatly into rational categories. By the end of my third full day in the mansion, I had established a routine. Wake at first light, eat whatever I had, work on the house until I had to leave for my shift, come back, work until dark, sleep, repeat. The routine was simple and it was grueling. And it was exactly what I needed because it left no space for the kind of thinking that would have broken me if I'd given it room. I had cleared 3 rooms on the ground floor to a state that was at least functional. I had identified the back portion of the house as structurally sound enough to live in safely. I had found a water pump in the backyard that with some effort could be coaxed into producing a trickle of brown water that eventually ran clear enough to use for washing. I had collected enough fallen branches and dead wood from the property to build small fires in the cast iron stove in the kitchen, which still worked, which still drew, which still turned wood into heat the same way it had been doing for decades. I was finding my footing, slowly, clumsily, with blisters on my hands and splinters in my fingers and a permanent ache in my lower back from bending and lifting and carrying. But I was finding it. On the 4th day, everything changed. I was reinforcing the floor in one of the ground floor rooms, testing each board with my foot, pressing down to feel the solidity before trusting it with my full weight. It was slow work, methodical, the kind of task that requires you to be entirely present in your body, because one wrong step could send you through rotting wood into whatever was underneath. My foot came down on a spot near the far wall and something moved. Not the way a broken board moves, collapsing under pressure. Not the way a rotten plank shifts when it's about to give way. This was different. The board moved like it was hinged, like it was designed to move, like someone a long time ago had built it to do exactly what it just did. I stepped back, got down on my knees, brushed away the dirt and debris with my hands working carefully, the way you clear earth when you suspect there's something underneath that matters. And there it was. A trapdoor, solid wood, a ring of rusted iron set into the center. It was so perfectly fitted into the rest of the floor that if I hadn't stepped on that exact spot at that exact angle with that exact amount of pressure, I never would have noticed it. You could have lived in that house for years and walked over it every single day and never known it was there. Whoever built it had wanted it hidden, had wanted it to be found only by someone who was paying very close attention or who was very, very lucky. I knelt in front of that trapdoor for a long time. My phone flashlight was in my hand, the beam pointed at the iron ring. My heart was beating in a way that I could feel in my throat and my fingertips behind my eyes. There was no objective reason to be afraid. I knew that. It was a door in a floor. Whatever was down there had been down there for decades. It wasn't going to hurt me. But the weight of that moment, the feeling of being about to open something that nobody had opened in a very long time, something that was keeping some secret I didn't know, was heavy in a way that went beyond rational thought. I grabbed the ring. I pulled. The trapdoor opened with a dry sound, wood dragging against wood, like a long exhale. Dust rose in a cloud that caught the light from the window and turned golden for a moment before settling back down. I waited for the air to clear. Then I pointed the phone flashlight into the opening and saw a wooden staircase descending into darkness. 8 steps. I counted them as I went down, one hand on the rough stone wall to my left, the other holding the phone out in front of me. The light bounced off the walls and created shadows that moved as I moved, making the space feel alive in a way that made my skin tighten. When the sole of my sneaker touched the packed earth floor at the bottom, I stopped. I raised the flashlight. I swept it slowly across the space in front of me. And what I saw took my breath away in a way I had never experienced before. It was a room, much larger than I had expected. The walls were made of stone, the same stone as the facade of the house, above rough cut and fitted together with a precision that spoke of someone who understood building materials the way a musician understands an instrument. The ceiling was dark wood about 8 feet above my head, supported by beams that ran the length of the room in parallel lines. And on those walls, from the floor to as high as a person could reach, there were paintings, not scribbles, not simple decorations, not the kind of amateur art you find in abandoned houses left behind because it wasn't worth taking. These were works. Large, some of them immense, with human figures rendered in a style that combined classical technique with something rawer, more personal, more alive. The expressions on the faces of the people in those paintings were so vivid that I felt, standing there in the half-dark with my phone flashlight, that they were looking back at me. There were landscapes with a depth of field that seemed impossible given that they had been created in this underground space. Rolling fields under skies that seemed to actually recede into distance, painted by someone who understood light, not as an abstract concept, but as something physical, something with weight and direction and mood. There were scenes I couldn't immediately identify, but that had a narrative force that caught my eye and held it. 2 figures standing at the edge of a field at dusk. A woman alone at a window, seen from behind, looking out at something the viewer couldn't see. a pair of hands holding a compass, the details so precise I could see the scratches on the brass casing. Some of the works were framed and hung on the walls with care, spaced evenly positioned at heights that suggested someone had thought about how they would be viewed. Others were leaning against each other along the sides of the room, wrapped in cloths that time had yellowed. Still others were rolled inside leather tubes, arranged on wooden shelves that ran along an entire wall, dozens of them, each one containing a work that no one had unrolled in decades. I walked slowly through the middle of all of it, turning the flashlight in every direction, trying to count, trying to grasp the scale of what I was seeing. There were dozens of works, perhaps more than 100. And in the center of the room there was a work table. Large, dark wood, its surface stained with paint in every color imaginable, layers upon layers that time had hardened into a topographic map of a creative life. On the table there were brushes hardened inside glass jars, tubes of paint dried and cracked wooden palettes, with layers of color built up over years, and there were notebooks, several of them leather-bound, stacked with care, and letters. Bundles of letters tied with ribbon, still in their envelopes, the paper soft with age, and newspaper clippings with dates and text in French. I sat down on the floor of that underground studio. I sat in the middle of all of it with the flashlight in my lap, looking around, and I started to cry. It wasn't a cry of fear. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't relief. It was a kind of crying I couldn't name in that moment. Only much later did I understand what it was. It was the cry of someone who had spent a long time feeling invisible, and who had suddenly found proof that there was another way to exist, that there was the possibility of leaving something in the world that lasts after you're gone, that there was a language beyond words, beyond shouting and silence and closed doors, a language that doesn't age and doesn't rot and doesn't disappear. I stayed in that studio for hours that day. I didn't touch anything. I just looked. I just felt the presence of all those paintings around me, the accumulated weight of years of solitary creation, the testimony of someone who had spent their entire life making things that nobody else would ever see. Before I climbed back up, I picked up one of the leather notebooks with care. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small, tilted slightly to the right, very regular, the hand of someone accustomed to writing with attention, with intention, with the discipline of a person who treated words the same way they treated brushstrokes. And in the upper corner of the first page there was a name, Elena Caldwell, April 12th, 1948. In the days that followed, I went up and down that staircase more times than I could count. Each time I went down, I stayed longer. I started opening the notebooks carefully with clean hands, trying not to damage the pages that time had made as fragile as old skin. The handwriting was consistent, disciplined, but full of personality. Sometimes the sentences were extremely short, almost telegraphic. A single observation about light or color, or the way a particular shade of blue behaved differently on canvas than it did in her mind. Sometimes they went on for entire pages, dense reflections on art, on technique, on what it means to create something that didn't exist before you made it. I began assembling the puzzle piece by piece. Elena Caldwell had been born in 1912, the daughter of a Scots-Irish family that had been in Louisiana for 2 generations, working people. Her father was a builder, her mother a seamstress. They had arrived with nothing and constructed something through hard labor the way families of that era did, one brick at a time, one stitch at a time, one day at a time. Elena grew up between the world her parents had built and the world she could see in her own mind, which was vastly larger and more colorful and more complicated than anything their daily life contained. From a very young age, she showed an aptitude for art that didn't fit inside the routine of a working family. She drew on every surface she could find. She mixed pigments from plants and dirt and anything that would leave a mark. She saw things differently than the people around her. And that difference was both her gift and her isolation. In one of the earliest notebooks, she wrote about how her father viewed her obsession with painting with suspicion. How he thought it was wasted time, something for children, something she would need to grow out of when the time came to be a real adult. But there was also between the lines an enormous tenderness when she spoke about her father. A comprehension that came from someone who loved deeply but didn't expect to be understood. At 23 years old in 1935, she had received a scholarship through a cultural association that sent her to France, to Paris, to study at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière with masters, whose students had gone on to shape the landscape of modern European art. She studied for 3 years. She frequented studios, met artists, attended exhibitions, walked through the Louvre and the galleries of Montmartre. She breathed art in a way that the notebooks from that period overflowed with excitement, with discovery, with a sense of belonging that she had clearly never found anywhere else. She wrote about Paris the way some people write about falling in love. Not with grand declarations, but with the accumulation of small, specific details. The quality of light on the Seine at 4 p.m. in October. The smell of turpentine in the studio on Rue Vavin where she worked. The sound of rain on the zinc roof above her tiny apartment. The way her teacher, an old man with paint permanently under his fingernails, would stand behind her at the easel and say nothing for 20 minutes and then make a single observation that changed everything about how she saw the canvas in front of her. There was one passage from 1936 that I read so many times the edges of the page began to soften under my fingertips. She had gone alone to the Louvre on a Tuesday morning in November when the galleries were nearly empty, and the guards stood at their posts with the bored stillness of men who had spent years watching other people look at things they themselves had stopped seeing a long time ago. She found herself in a room with a painting she had studied in reproduction but had never stood before. She didn't name the painting. She didn't describe it in technical terms. What she wrote was this: I stood in front of it, and I understood for the first time that a painting is not a surface. It is a depth. It goes into the wall. It goes through the wall. It opens into a space that exists only because someone sat down and decided to make it exist. I stayed until a guard asked if I was all right. I told him I was better than I had ever been. He looked at me like I was slightly mad. Perhaps I was. She wrote about her classmates at the academy. A woman from Belgium who painted only hands, dozens and dozens of studies of hands in every position and every light, because she believed that you could read a person's entire life in the way they held their fingers. A man from Italy who worked exclusively in shades of gray, because he said color was a distraction from form and form was the only truth painting could offer. An older student from Sweden who never spoke to anyone during working hours, but who in the evenings at the cafe on the corner of Boulevard du Montparnasse would talk for hours about the relationship between music and visual composition, drawing connections that made Elena see her own work differently. She was happy in Paris in a way that the notebooks made almost painful to read, because I already knew she was going to leave. I already knew what was coming. Reading those entries was like watching someone walk toward the edge of something beautiful without knowing that the ground was about to end. But the Europe of the late 1930s was not a peaceful place to be. War was writing itself into every conversation, every newspaper, every face of every artist she lived among. You could feel it coming the way you feel a storm approaching, not by seeing it, but by the change in pressure, the way everything gets quieter and heavier, and the air itself seems to hold its breath. There was an entry from early 1938 that captured the shift. The German students have stopped coming to the studio. Their easels stand empty along the wall. Nobody moves them. Nobody talks about it. We paint around the absence like it's a still life we've all agreed not to look at. In 1938, she returned home bringing in her luggage not only the technical knowledge and the aesthetic influences she had absorbed, but also an invisible wound. A certain melancholy that the notebooks from that period described as the pain of someone who found the place where she should have been born but couldn't stay. The years between her return and the construction of the mansion were not empty years. They were some of the most productive of her life, though also the most solitary. She lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, a 2-room structure with a tin roof and a porch that faced west, so that the afternoon light came through the windows at the angle she preferred for working. She had converted the back room into a studio of sorts, though it was nothing compared to what Gabriel would later build for her. The ceiling was too low. The light was inconsistent. The temperature swung from unbearable in summer to barely tolerable in winter, but she worked in it every day. She had no choice. Working was how she breathed. Back in Louisiana, she settled in this area where her family had lived. With the inheritance she received when her father died a few years later, she bought land. But she didn't build the house herself. The house came later, and it didn't come from her. Elena painted. She filled canvases with everything she had learned in Paris, filtered through everything she had felt growing up in the Louisiana countryside, creating a style that was entirely her own, rooted in 2 worlds and belonging fully to neither. She wrote her notebooks. She lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, and she refused every gallery that came knocking. She had received at least 5 offers from different galleries over the years, all recorded in the notebooks, all rejected. She had a theory about what happens to art when it exists to be sold, and she described it with a precision that made me think she had watched it happen to artists she had known in Paris. She called it death by exposure, the slow erosion of something genuine through the process of turning it into a product. The way a painting changes when it's hung on a gallery wall with a price tag. The way the artist changes when they start thinking about what will sell instead of what needs to be made. She wasn't naive about how the world worked. She understood money and commerce and the practical realities of being a person who needs to eat and pay rent. But she had drawn a line and she would not cross it. Her art was not for sale. Her art was for the making of it, and the making of it was enough. There was one entry from 1956 that I read so many times I could recite it from memory. She wrote about a gallery owner from the state capital who had driven all the way out to see her, who had been impressed by the work, who told her she was wasting her talent out here alone, far from everyone. She served him tea. She listened politely. She declined. He didn't understand. He told her she was making a mistake. She walked to the window and looked at the garden while he packed up the documents he had brought with him. And she wrote, sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to expose yourself, but to resist the pressure to expose yourself, when exposure would mean betraying something fundamental. The paradox, of course, was that by protecting her work from commercialization, she was also protecting it from any form of public permanence. The paintings stayed in that studio, being created and stored and never seen by anyone other than her. There was an enormous weight to that. I could feel it in the notebooks as the years progressed. The voice that in the early pages was full of conviction became more hesitant in the later entries. Not about the art itself, about its fate, about what would happen to all those canvases and all those years of work after she was gone. And then at some point in my reading of those notebooks, something else appeared. Something the notebooks didn't explain fully. Something that lived in the spaces between the lines, appeared in fragments, was mentioned with a deliberateness that seemed intentional, as if she were writing about something so precious she could only approach it sideways. It was a man. He appeared for the first time in the notebook from 1952 in a mention so casual it almost slipped past me. The sound of the engine above pulled me out of concentration. He flew low today, as always, when he knows I'm in the garden, Gabriel and his planes. Sometimes I think he does it on purpose. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I went forward in the notebooks, went back, started assembling what I could. Gabriel Hargrove had arrived in the region in 1949. A civilian pilot, one of the few in the area at that time. Son of a well-off Southern family with roots that went back generations. He had learned to fly during the Second World War, serving as a transport pilot on supply routes that no one else wanted to fly, routes over water and mountains and through weather that turned experienced pilots around. He had seen enough things from the cockpit to come back to Louisiana different from how he had left. In Elena's notebooks, Gabriel was described as a man of few words who, when he finally spoke, said things worth hearing. She wrote about him with a restraint that only made the emotion underneath more apparent, the way a dam makes the river behind it seem more powerful precisely because it's being held back. They had met in 1949 on one of the rare occasions when Elena had gone into town to buy materials. Gabriel had landed one of his planes in a field near the road, an engine problem he needed to check. She had stopped to ask if he needed help. He had said no. It was mechanical. She didn't need to worry about it. She had responded that she knew the difference between a carburetor and a piston because her father had been a mechanic before becoming a builder, and that if he wanted a second pair of eyes, she had time. They stayed there for 2 hours on the side of the road with the plane open between them, talking about engines and then about painting, about the France she had left behind, about the war he had seen from the cockpit, which was different from seeing it from the ground, but no less heavy to carry. 2 people standing on a dirt road in Louisiana with the hood of an airplane between them, discovering that they spoke the same language. A language that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with the way they each related to the world, with precision, with attention, with a care for the things they touched. In the notebooks, Elena described that first meeting with the kind of detail she usually reserved for paintings. She noted the grease on his hands, the specific shade of it, darker than engine oil with a slight blue undertone. She noted the way he talked about the plane's engine with what she called affection without sentimentality, the way a person talks about a tool they respect. She noted that when she mentioned Paris, his face changed in a way that made her think he understood something about distance and longing that most people in this town had never experienced. He didn't ask to see her again. She didn't offer. They fixed the engine, or at least identified the problem well enough for him to fly it to a proper mechanic, and they went their separate ways. But Elena wrote in a line that had been underlined with a different pen at some later date, as if she had come back to it and wanted to mark it. I have the feeling that something just started. I don't know what, but I have the feeling. In the years that followed, Gabriel flew over Elena's property more times than he could justify for any practical reason. She never complained. Sometimes when the weather was good, she would hang a white cloth on the post in the garden, and he knew it meant he could land. That white cloth was their private signal, their wordless communication, visible from hundreds of feet in the air, a small flag of welcome that meant the same thing every time. Come down. I'm here. I want you here too. The notebooks from the early 1950s were full of afternoons spent together, always described from Elena's perspective, always with the restraint of a woman who treated her private feelings the way she treated her best paintings, with enormous care, and no interest in displaying them to anyone who hadn't earned the right to look. Gabriel would land in the field and walk to the cottage, and they would sit on the porch and talk or not talk, depending on the day. Sometimes he brought her mechanical parts that he thought she might find interesting, gears and couplings and small intricate pieces of engine that he cleaned and polished before giving to her, because he knew she would see them not as machine components, but as forms, as shapes, as things with their own beauty that most people were too practical to notice. In one entry from 1951, she described an afternoon when Gabriel had brought her a propeller blade from a decommissioned training plane. He had carried it on his back from the airfield wrapped in a canvas tarp, and when he unwrapped it on her porch, the late light caught the metal surface and threw a reflection across the wall of the cottage that moved slowly as the sun moved. They watched that reflection for almost an hour, she wrote, sitting in silence, watching a blade of light travel across the wooden wall, like the hand of a clock that was keeping a different kind of time. She drew the reflection in her notebook. A simple sketch in the margin of the page, just a few lines, but with the precision and confidence of someone who could capture the essence of a thing with almost no effort. And beside the sketch, she wrote, "He sees things the way I see things. He just uses different tools." He kept 2 aircraft that he used for both work and for the simple pleasure of being in the air where the world below looked small and ordered in a way it never was when you were inside it. She painted, filled the small cottage with works no one saw, wrote her notebooks, refused the gallery, served tea to unwanted visitors, and waited for them to leave. Theirs was not a conventional love story. There were no grand declarations in the notebooks, no dramatic professions of feeling. It was something rarer. 2 people who recognized in each other a way of being in the world that they had never found in anyone else. 2 people who understood that some forms of love don't need to announce themselves to exist. There were entries that spanned years where the only evidence of Gabriel was a single sentence. "He came today. We worked on the garden." Or, "Gabriel flew over at sunset. The shadow of the plane crossed the field in a straight line. I watched it until it disappeared." And then there were pages that were dense with observations about him, about things he'd said or done, written with the care of someone who was studying him, the way she studied light, not to capture him, but to understand him, and through understanding him to understand something about herself. And then reading deeper into the letters and the notebooks, I began to understand the cars. Gabriel was also passionate about vehicles, not a collector in the formal sense. He didn't buy for investment or status. He bought for the love of machines, for the same kind of relationship he had with his planes. The feel of an engine turning over, the logic of mechanical systems, the satisfaction of understanding how something works by taking it apart and putting it back together. And the ones that broke down, the ones that reached the limit of what he could repair, the ones that simply couldn't serve any practical purpose anymore, they stayed on the property. Not out of laziness, out of something closer to what Elena felt about her paintings. The inability to discard something that had once been a part of your life. Each of those 11 cars represented some journey, some moment, some version of Gabriel that no longer existed but had existed once. They were his canvases. In a way, the evidence of a life lived through machines. But none of this, none of the cars or the planes or the notebooks or the paintings prepared me for what I found next. In a locked drawer in the desk in the library, a drawer I managed to open with a paper clip, after 2 hours of patient, frustrating work that left my fingers aching and my patience nearly spent, there were letters. Not Elena's notebooks, which were her private thoughts, her internal world made visible in ink. These were letters, correspondence between 2 people, letters from Gabriel to Elena written during the construction of the house. And when I read the first one, I had to stop. I had to sit down on the edge of the makeshift bed I had assembled from an old mattress I found in one of the upstairs rooms, and I had to process what I was reading. Because I had bought this property from a man who barely spoke to me, who refused to answer a single question about the history of the place, who signed the papers and left like he was shedding a weight he'd carried for years. And now I was discovering that this place was not the house of a solitary painter. This was a house that a man had built because of a woman. Gabriel had bought the land in 1951. He had overseen the construction of the mansion over the course of 2 years, but he hadn't built it for himself. The letters described every room as if he were giving a gift that didn't exist yet, but that he could already see with absolute clarity in his imagination. The width of the windows calculated to maximize natural light at certain hours of the day. The orientation of the rooms chosen for the way the morning sun would enter from the east, and the afternoon light would come from the west. The stone facade. Because Elena had once mentioned that the buildings she loved most in Paris were the ones made of stone, the ones that felt like they had grown out of the ground rather than being placed on top of it. In one of the letters dated March 1952, he wrote something that I have never forgotten. I had them dig out the room below the east bedroom today. The foreman looked at me strange when I explained the dimensions and the orientation I wanted. But he did it the way I asked. The walls are stone, the way you wanted to keep the temperature steady. The staircase has 8 steps the way you told me you needed. When you go down for the first time, I want to be standing there to see your face. I needed to breathe deeply after reading that. The underground studio had not been built by Elena. It had been built by Gabriel following her specifications. As a gift. As the greatest gift that a man in love could imagine for the woman he loved more than anything. A secret space protected permanent where her art could exist without being disturbed by the world. Every detail of that construction had a reason and intention, a consciousness behind it. The staircase with its deliberately uneven steps designed so that anyone going down couldn't do it without paying attention, which forced you always to descend slowly with intention, as if you were entering a different state of mind. Elena had described that need to Gabriel in a conversation I could only reconstruct from the fragments in her notebooks, and he had translated it into architecture. Into wood and stone and iron, into a physical reality that would outlast both of them. I sat with that knowledge for days. I went back to the letters. I found Elena's letters to Gabriel tucked between the pages of her notebooks like bookmarks folded carefully, written with more restraint than his, but with an intensity underneath the surface that was unmistakable, like heat coming off asphalt, that you can see in the shimmer of the air but can never touch. His letters were direct, unadorned, written the way her notebook said he spoke. Short sentences that carried more meaning than their length suggested. Hers were more careful with words, more deliberate, each phrase weighted and considered the work of someone who treated language with the same respect she gave to paint. The story I assembled letter by letter, entry by entry, was at the same time the most beautiful and the most devastating thing I had ever read. They had known each other since 1949. For years they had existed in an orbit around each other, drawn together by something neither of them could name directly in writing, but that was visible in every line, in every mention, in every careful description of an afternoon spent together. That was ostensibly about engines or paint or the quality of light on a particular day. Gabriel built the mansion. Elena moved in. The studio was finished. She went down those 8 steps for the first time, and what she felt she wrote about in a single notebook entry that took up only 3 lines. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. The walls were waiting. I touched the stone, and it was cool and solid and exactly right. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and that was enough. She spent the next 15 years filling those walls with the best work of her life, painting in that underground space that maintained a constant temperature, a constant silence, a constant sense of being removed from the world above, in a way that allowed her to create without distraction, without pressure, without the weight of anyone's expectations about what art should be. And Gabriel flew his planes, maintained his cars, visited Elena, landed in the field when the white cloth was on the post, left when he needed to leave, came back when he could. 2 people who understood each other completely and who had found a way to exist together without requiring each other to change, without demanding, without grasping, without the kind of possession that so many people mistake for love. And then in September of 1968, something broke. The entries in Elena's notebooks from that period became shorter, more sparse with a different quality to them, like she was writing in a hurry or with exhaustion or with some weight she couldn't bring herself to name. The careful handwriting became less even. The spacing between words got wider, as if the pen was being lifted more often, as if there were pauses in the middle of sentences that you could see on the page. In an entry from October of that year, she wrote only 5 words. Gabriel went away today. I don't know if he's coming back. Nothing more. No explanation. No context. As if the fact was so heavy that it couldn't hold elaboration. 5 words sitting alone on a page in a notebook full of dense, articulate thought. 5 words that were louder than everything that surrounded them. I went looking for more. I checked every corner of the studio, every fold of paper inside the notebooks, every drawer I hadn't yet opened. And it was behind one of the largest canvases, a painting that depicted 2 airplanes in flight over an open field at sunset. A sunset I only recognized as being exactly this property when I looked closely at the shape of the tree line and the angle of the light, that I found an envelope taped to the back of the stretcher bars. Gabriel's last letter. It was longer than all the others, much longer, and the handwriting, normally steady and firm, was irregular in several places, as if his hand had been trembling while he wrote. He explained that he had discovered almost by accident that he was being investigated. For years he had been using his flight routes across the region to transport, in addition to legitimate cargo people who needed to cross borders without appearing in official records. Not criminals, at least, not in any sense he recognized as crime. Families fleeing regimes in Central America and the Caribbean. Intellectuals whose names had appeared on the wrong lists during the Cold War years. People who needed a pilot who wouldn't ask questions and wouldn't file reports. He had never charged for it, not $1. He had done it because it seemed right, because he had seen from the cockpit of his airplane what happened to people who didn't manage to escape in time. He had seen it during the war, and he had seen it after, and he had decided that if he had the means to help and chose not to, then the cockpit, which had always been the place where he felt most himself, would become a place he couldn't stand to sit in anymore. But someone had talked, and now there was an investigation. And if he stayed, if he remained close to Elena and the mansion, he would drag her into it with him. He would expose the studio, the paintings, everything she had built in silence over decades, everything he had built for her, the secret they had protected together. He would not let that happen. So he was leaving, not far, not forever, but for an indefinite time until the situation resolved itself one way or another. The planes he was leaving behind because he couldn't take them without drawing attention. The cars, too. The mansion, too. Everything stayed as it was. Everything except him. The letter ended with words that I have carried with me every day since I read them. You asked me once what I felt when I was up there, above everything. With the whole world down below looking small and neat in a way it never does when you're inside it. I never knew how to answer that well. But now that I'm leaving, not knowing when I'll come back, I think I know. What I felt up there was the same thing I feel when I walk down those 8 steps and stand in the middle of your paintings. The feeling of being exactly where I belong. Keep the studio. Keep the paintings. I'll come back when I can. Gabriel never came back. I sat on the floor of that studio with his letter in my hand for a very long time. From above, through the opening of the trapdoor, a rectangle of afternoon light fell into the space like a doorway made of gold. I looked at the painting of the 2 planes in flight. I looked at the walls full of works that Elena had created over decades in this space that Gabriel had built for her. I thought about the two of them separated by a circumstance neither of them had chosen, each carrying the absence of the other in a different way but with equal weight. I tried to imagine Elena reading this letter for the first time, standing in this same room, holding this same paper, processing the same words I had just read. She had stood exactly where I was sitting, and she had learned that the man she loved was gone. Not dead. Not yet. Just gone. Somewhere south, somewhere beyond the reach of the investigation. Somewhere that was not here. And the distance between here and there was measured not in miles, but in everything that they had built together and could not take with them. I tried to imagine the day after. Elena waking up in the mansion alone, coming down to the studio without the possibility of Gabriel ever descending behind her, picking up a brush, loading it with color, putting it to canvas. The first stroke of the first painting she would make in a world where the white cloth on the garden post meant nothing anymore because there was no one in the sky to see it. How do you keep painting after that? How do you walk down those stairs every morning and stand in front of a canvas and create something when the person who built the space you're standing in is gone and might never come back? How do you fill walls that were meant to hold the work of a life shared and now hold only the work of a life alone? I think the answer is that you don't think about it. You just do it. The way my mother went to work the day after my father left. The way I went to my shift at the grocery store the morning after she told me I had a week. The way human beings have always survived the things that should, by all rights, destroy them. Not through courage, not through wisdom. Through the simple animal refusal to stop doing the thing you were made to do. Elena painted. That was what she was made to do. So she painted. And I thought about myself. On the night at the bus stop. The closed door. The broken suitcase. The way certain losses don't have an explanation sufficient to make them any easier to carry. Something connected in that moment. Not in a poetic or abstract way. In a physical, concrete way right in the center of my chest. Elena had lost Gabriel. Gabriel had lost Elena. And both of them, each in their own way, had transformed that loss into something that endured. She, through the paintings. He, through the mansion that was still standing decades later, holding everything she had created. I hadn't lost anything of that magnitude. But I had lost enough to understand the language of that grief, and I understood now with a clarity I hadn't had before why I had felt that recognition when I first looked at the photo of the mansion, why I had called that number with my hands shaking, why I had come here with everything I had. I hadn't found an abandoned mansion. I had found proof that it is possible to build something that lasts, even when everything around it is falling apart. Even when the person you love is gone. Even when the door closes in your face. Even when you are alone with $16 in a suitcase with a broken wheel. It was during that week that I met Old Beau. I had asked around at the hardware store in town about someone who could help with basic structural assessment. Someone who knew old construction and wouldn't charge more than I could possibly pay. 3 different people gave me the same name. He showed up on a Tuesday morning in a truck that was older than I was, a tall man of 75, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as the houses he'd spent his life building. He got out of the truck, stood at the gate, and looked at the mansion for a long time without saying a word. Then he walked up to the stone facade and put his palm flat against it. He stood like that for almost a minute, his hand on the stone, his eyes moving over the arches and the lintels and the way the blocks were fitted together. Whoever built this knew exactly what he was doing. I said, I know. His name was Gabriel. Old Beau turned and looked at me. Something passed across his face, a flicker of recognition or memory or both. And then it was gone, and his expression settled back into the quiet neutrality of a man who had learned a long time ago that some things take their own time to surface. He'd met Gabriel once, decades ago, when he was a young apprentice working on a house across town. Gabriel had come by to look at the stonework, asked questions about the mortar and the techniques being used, talked about his own house, the one he was building outside of town. Old Beau remembered him as a man who understood materials, who knew the difference between building something to last a few years and building something to last a century. Old Beau didn't try to lead me. He didn't try to take over. He answered questions when I asked them, told me which walls were load-bearing and which weren't, showed me where the foundation was solid and where it needed attention, pointed out things I never would have seen on my own, the way a certain crack in the plaster indicated movement in the structure below, the way the angle of the roofline had shifted over the years, the way water had been finding its way in through channels that weren't visible from the inside. But every decision was mine. Every choice about what to fix first, what to leave for later, what to prioritize, he left to me. He'd give me the information, I'd make the call, and then he'd nod once and get to work. That was the arrangement. That was how it stayed. He also solved a problem I hadn't been able to solve on my own. On his third visit, he noticed I was leaving before 5 in the morning to catch the first bus toward town. He asked where I worked. I told him. He didn't say anything that day. But the next morning, when I walked out to the gate at 4:45, there was a bicycle leaning against the gate post. Not new, not pretty. A heavy steel frame with thick tires and a basket zip-tied to the handlebars. He had left it there without a note. Without a word. Just a bicycle that cut my commute in half and gave me back 2 hours a day that I desperately needed. I never thanked him for it directly. He never brought it up. That was how Old Beau operated. He saw a problem, he fixed it. And then he moved on to the next thing without waiting for gratitude or acknowledgement, or any of the social rituals that most people require before they'll lift a finger for someone else. And in the evenings after he'd gone home, I would go back down to the studio and sit with Elena's notebooks and Gabriel's letters, reading by flashlight, assembling the rest of a story that I was beginning to realize was not just about two people who had loved each other in a way the world would never know. It was about something larger, something about what we leave behind and why and who finds it and what they do with it. It was in that week that I decided I was going to do whatever it took to protect what Elena and Gabriel had built. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know what it would cost or how long it would take or what I would have to fight through to make it happen. But I knew the way you know certain things not in your head but in your body, that this was what I was supposed to do, that this was the reason I had found that listing in the classifieds, the reason I had called that number with shaking hands, the reason I had walked down a dirt road with a broken suitcase and said yes to something that everyone else had said no to. Elena had spent her life creating in silence, protecting her work from a world she didn't trust to value it correctly. Gabriel had spent years building a space for that creation and then walked away from it to protect her. And now, decades later, a girl with nothing to her name had walked in off the street and found it all still intact, still waiting, still carrying the weight of everything that had been poured into it. The question wasn't whether it was worth saving. The question was whether I was capable of saving it. And the only answer I had was that I was going to try. The first step was understanding what I had from a practical standpoint. I didn't know art in any technical or commercial sense. I knew the paintings affected me in a way that went deeper than anything I had experienced before, but I didn't have the vocabulary or the knowledge to measure what they represented in the real world. I called the art department at the State University, explained over the phone that I had found a collection of paintings in a property I had purchased and that I needed an initial evaluation. The woman who answered transferred me 3 times before I reached someone who seemed genuinely curious rather than skeptical. Her name was Professor Joan Whitfield, and she agreed to come see the property the following week. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a small car that looked too clean for the dirt road it had just traveled. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back tight and glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck and put on only when she needed to look at something closely. She carried a large bag and a notebook and an expression that suggested she had seen a great many things in her career and was not easily impressed. I led her through the house without saying much. She looked at the rooms with professional interest but without lingering. It was clear that she was waiting for whatever I had brought her here to see, and that the mansion itself, however striking, was not it. When we reached the trapdoor, I opened it and gestured for her to follow. She looked at the opening in the floor, then at me, then back at the opening. She put on her glasses, and she went down. I had positioned battery-powered lanterns around the room by then, bought with money I earned from extra shifts at the grocery store. The light wasn't perfect, but it was enough to see everything. Professor Whitfield reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. She stood there and she did not move for almost 10 minutes. I watched her from near the staircase. She walked slowly between the canvases, sometimes bending down to look more closely, sometimes stepping back to see from a distance, sometimes standing completely still in front of a single work for a length of time that seemed out of proportion to everything else. Her face changed as she moved through the room. The professional composure she had arrived with softened into something else. Something I recognized because I had felt it myself the first time I came down here. Wonder. The specific kind of wonder that comes from encountering something you didn't know existed and realizing it changes what you thought you knew. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from when she had arrived. Lower, more careful. Like someone choosing words the way Elena chose colors with precision and respect for what they were being used to describe. Do you know what you have here? I said I didn't. Not exactly. She took off her glasses, put them back on the chain, looked at me in a way that made me feel like she was seeing me for the first time. Elena Caldwell, she said, was one of the most talented painters of her generation in this state. Possibly in this country. She was known in art circles during her lifetime primarily for her period of study in Paris and for the handful of works that were seen by visitors to her cottage before she withdrew completely from public life. There was speculation for decades about the whereabouts of her personal collection because she never exhibited, formally never sold a single piece. And when she died, there was no official inventory of her works. Some believed the paintings had been destroyed. Others thought they had been sold informally to private collectors who kept them hidden. No one knew they were here. She paused. She looked around the room one more time, slowly taking in the full scope of what surrounded us. This is a historical discovery. It is probably the largest private art collection that was off the public record in the history of this state. 134 works plus notebooks, correspondence, and documentation that constitute a complete archive of a major artist's creative life. She paused again. And you bought all of this for what you had in your pocket. I needed to sit down. But what came next was not a celebration. It was the beginning of a fight I hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared for. I don't know how the news got out. Maybe someone at the university mentioned it. Maybe Mr. Pardo, who had sold me the property, spoke to someone. Maybe it was simply the nature of small towns where information travels through invisible channels, the way water finds its way through rock slowly and inevitably and impossible to contain. The fact is that 3 weeks after Professor Whitfield's visit, a man appeared at my gate. He was wearing a gray suit. He carried a black briefcase. and he had the expression of someone accustomed to making people smaller than him feel even smaller. His name was Richard Crane. He was an attorney, and he represented 2 grandnieces and 1 grandnephew of Elena Caldwell, members of a family called Fontaine people whose names did not appear in a single one of Elena's notebooks, who had never set foot in this mansion, who probably could not have said their great-aunt's full name without consulting a document, but who, upon hearing about a collection that might be worth a significant amount of money, had suddenly discovered a deep and urgent interest in the family heritage. Their argument was simple. The works had been created by Elena Caldwell. Regardless of who owned the property, the artistic estate was a matter of blood inheritance, and they wanted it. Crane presented me with an offer for the entire collection. All 134 works, plus the notebooks, the letters, the documentation. Everything. The number he put on the table was so low, it was almost insulting, the kind of offer you make when you're counting on the other person being too poor or too scared or too ignorant to know better. I said no. His expression didn't change. He told me he hoped I would reconsider, that these situations could become complicated, that inheritance law was clear on certain points, that legal proceedings were long and expensive, and that I clearly did not have the resources to sustain one. I told him he could leave. He left, but he came back, not in person, but through letters on firm letterhead that arrived at the property with mechanical regularity, through phone calls at inconvenient hours, 7 in the morning, 9 at night, always polite, always measured, always carrying the subtext of a threat wrapped in legal language that I couldn't fully decode. The first letter arrived 3 days after his visit. It was addressed to me formally using my full name, which he could only have obtained from the property records. The letter stated that his clients had retained his firm to pursue all available legal remedies regarding the disposition of the artistic estate of Elena Caldwell, and that I was advised to seek legal counsel of my own. It was signed with a pen that left a thick, confident line, the kind of signature that a person practices until it becomes a weapon. The second letter arrived a week later. It was longer. It referenced specific statutes. It used phrases like equitable distribution and rightful heirs and the fiduciary duty of the current property holder to preserve and remit cultural assets to their proper custodians. I read it 3 times and understood perhaps half of it, but the half I understood was enough to make my chest tight. The phone calls started after the second letter. The first one came at 7:15 on a Monday morning when I was eating cold bread in the kitchen before leaving for my shift. A woman's voice professional identified herself as calling from Crane's firm and asked if I had given consideration to the offer that had been presented. I said I had not changed my mind. She said she hoped I would reconsider and hung up before I could respond. The calls continued, sometimes in the morning, sometimes at night, always the same format, always the same measured tone, always the same implicit suggestion that I was making a mistake that would cost me more than I could afford. They never threatened directly. They didn't need to. The threat was in the consistency, in the relentlessness, in the simple fact that they could afford to keep calling, and I could not afford a phone bill that was higher than it should have been. And then there was the night visit. I don't know who it was. I never saw a face. But at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, I heard a sound outside and looked through the window to see a figure standing on the other side of the gate, not moving, not trying to get in, just standing there in the dark for almost 30 minutes, a silhouette against the faint light from the road. And then they left. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the kitchen with the cast iron stove between me and the window and waited for dawn. When the first gray light appeared in the sky, I went outside and checked the gate. It was still locked. There were no marks on it, no signs that anyone had tried to force it open. Just footprints in the soft dirt outside, pressed deep by someone who had stood in one place for a long time. Someone who wanted me to know they had been there. I spent weeks sleeping badly after that. Not from fear exactly, but from a constant tension that lived in my shoulders and my jaw and the space behind my eyes. The feeling of being in a game whose rules I didn't understand well enough to play. I had made a promise to Elena sitting on the floor of her studio with her notebooks in my lap. But promises don't pay lawyers. Promises don't know inheritance law or intellectual property statutes, or the procedural requirements of a civil court. I started losing weight. Not intentionally. I just forgot to eat sometimes or couldn't muster the energy to prepare food after a full shift at the store and hours of work on the house. Old Beau noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, but he started bringing a paper bag with him when he came in the mornings. Inside was always something simple. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of coffee, a piece of fruit. He'd set it on the kitchen counter without ceremony and go straight to whatever he was working on. The first time he did it, I opened the bag and stared at the sandwich for a long moment, and something in my throat got tight and I had to look away so he wouldn't see. There were days when I sat in the studio and talked to Elena, not out loud, not like a person losing their grip on reality. In my head, I'd sit in front of her paintings and think, what would you do? You spent your whole life protecting this work. You refused 5 galleries. You painted for 40 years without selling a single piece. What would you do if someone showed up with a gray suit and a briefcase and told you it wasn't yours anymore? And the answer I always arrived at, the answer that the notebooks made unmistakable, was that she would not budge. She would sit exactly where she was, and she would not move. She would treat it the way she treated the galleries, the way she treated every force that tried to make her compromise the thing she had decided to protect. She would say no, and she would keep saying no until the other person got tired of hearing it. That's what I did. For weeks and then months, I said no. Every letter got the same response, a single line written on a piece of notebook paper. I do not accept your offer. Every phone call got the same answer. I have not changed my mind. I didn't elaborate, I didn't explain, I didn't defend or justify or argue. I just said no the way Elena would have said no, and I waited for whatever came next. Then the Fontaines escalated. They filed a formal lawsuit. But it wasn't just about blood inheritance anymore. Crane revealed in a preliminary hearing that the family had partnered with a real estate development company that had been interested in the property for years. The company wanted the land to build a resort, and they had discovered something that made my stomach drop. Mr. Pardo, the old man who had sold me the mansion, had been in debt, serious debt. The kind of debt that makes a person desperate enough to sell a property worth many times what he received for it. And the argument Crane made standing in that hearing room in his gray suit with his measured voice was that the transaction between Mr. Pardo and me could be voided by the court. That the sale price was so far below market value that it constituted evidence of a transaction made under duress or diminished capacity. That the property and everything in it should revert to the Fontaine family as Elena's legal heirs. I sat in that hearing room on a plastic chair and felt the floor opening under me. If the transaction was voided, I would lose everything. The house, the studio, the paintings, the notebooks, the letters, everything I had found, everything I had promised to protect, everything that Elena and Gabriel had built and hidden and loved in silence for decades. I went home that night and sat in the studio alone. I didn't turn on the lanterns, I just sat in the dark at the bottom of those stairs and listened to the silence and tried to think clearly through the noise of fear and exhaustion and the overwhelming sense that I was in over my head in ways I couldn't even fully comprehend. It was during the middle of the legal fight, at the point when the pressure was highest and I was sleeping the least, that something happened that I had not anticipated. I came home from work one evening and there was a woman standing at the gate. Not a figure in the dark, not a lawyer. A woman I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen her in months. Lorraine, my mother. She looked different, thinner, older in a way that wasn't just about time. She was holding a cardboard box, the kind you get from the grocery store, and she was standing very still, like someone who had driven a long way and used up all their courage getting to the gate and now had none left for whatever came next. I stood on the other side of the gate and we looked at each other for a long moment. Dale had left. She told me that quietly, without drama, the way you report a fact that has already been processed and accepted. He had been gone for 6 months. He had found someone else or somewhere else or some other version of the life he was always chasing, and Lorraine was alone in the house with the door that was no longer blue because the paint had finally peeled away entirely, and she hadn't repainted it. She didn't ask to come in. She held out the box. I took it. Inside was a small collection of things that I had left behind or that had fallen out of my suitcase during those frantic last minutes. The photograph of me with my grandmother. A hair clip my grandmother had given me that I had searched for during those 7 days and never found. And my notebook, the one I had been writing in since I was 15, which I had been certain I packed, but which had somehow ended up staying behind. She had kept these things for months. She had kept them in a box in a house that was emptier than it had ever been, and she had driven over an hour on a dirt road to bring them to me, and she had stood at the gate holding them without any guarantee that I would even open it. I opened the gate. We sat on the front gallery of the mansion, side by side on 2 old wooden chairs that old Beau had repaired the week before. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We sat in silence for a long time, looking out at the property, at the cars in the tall grass, at the plains in the distance, at the late afternoon light turning everything gold and green. I didn't know what to say, and she didn't know what to say, and so neither of us said anything for a while. The wind moved through the property the way it always did in the late afternoon, slow and warm, and carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere beyond the tree line. A mockingbird was singing in the live oak near the gate, cycling through its stolen melodies with the manic energy that mockingbirds bring to everything they do. As if the act of singing someone else's song required more effort than singing your own. Lorraine looked at the mansion for a long time. She didn't ask about it. She didn't say it was impressive or ask how I'd found it or what I was doing with it. She just looked at it the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand, without wanting to admit they need to understand it. I looked at her hands. They were in her lap, the way they had been that morning in the living room when she told me I had a week. The same position, but different. These hands were thinner, the veins more prominent, the skin rougher. These were the hands of a woman who had been living alone in a house that was too big for one person and too empty for the memories it contained. My mother spoke once. She said, "I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I need you to know that night was wrong." I didn't respond immediately. I let the words sit between us. I let them exist in the air alongside the sound of the mockingbird and the wind and the distant creak of one of the old cars settling deeper into the ground. I thought about the night at the bus stop, about the sound of her voice through the wall, about the 2 words that had decided my future. And I thought about the other night, the one I wasn't supposed to hear, when she had told Dale no, when she had drawn that one small line. Both of those things were true at the same time. Both of those things were her. She was the woman who had let me go, and the woman who had fought for my savings, and the woman who had kept my grandmother's photograph in a box for months and driven an hour on a dirt road to bring it back to me. She was all of those women at once, and the fact that they all existed inside the same person was what made forgiving her so complicated. Because if she had been simple, if she had been one thing, I could have responded to that one thing. But she wasn't simple. She was a person with all the contradictions and failures and small acts of grace that come with being a person. And people are much harder to forgive than ideas. I didn't forgive her. Not that day. Not in any dramatic moment of reconciliation that would make a clean ending to that part of the story. What I did was not send her away. I let her sit there. I let the silence between us be what it was, not comfortable but not hostile, just honest, just two people acknowledging a wound that was too deep to heal quickly, but perhaps not too deep to heal at all. She stayed for 3 days. She helped me clean. She swept floors and carried debris and didn't ask questions about the legal battle or the paintings or why her 18-year-old daughter was living alone in a mansion in the middle of nowhere. She worked quietly the way she had always worked, and I watched her sometimes from across a room and saw in her the same woman who had worked double shifts at the hospital laundry, who had eaten standing up because she was too tired to sit, who had squeezed my hand once without saying anything. That woman was still in there underneath everything that had happened since Dale walked into our lives. On the second evening, she found the kitchen stove. The cast iron one, the one with the pot still on top, the one that had made my stomach tighten the first time I saw it. She stood in front of it for a moment and then she started cleaning it. Without asking, without explaining. She just took a rag and started wiping down the surface with the efficiency of a woman who had spent decades cleaning things that other people didn't notice, needed cleaning. By the time she was done, the black iron had a dull shine to it that I hadn't seen since I arrived. And then she built a fire in it and cooked something. Just beans and rice with whatever spices she'd found in the box of supplies I kept on the counter. But she cooked it on that stove, the one that hadn't been used for cooking in decades, and the smell of it filled the kitchen and drifted into the hallway and up the staircase and into the rooms above. And for the first time, the mansion smelled like a place where someone lived instead of a place that had been abandoned. We ate together that night, sitting across from each other at the heavy wooden table in the dining room, the one I had cleaned but hadn't used, because eating alone at a table that seats 8 felt more like a reminder of solitude than a solution to it. We didn't talk much, but we ate together, and when she finished, she washed her plate and my plate, and dried them and put them away in the china cabinet. And the simple domesticity of that act, the normalcy of it, was so unexpected and so disarming that I had to leave the room for a minute to collect myself. When she left on the 3rd day, she hugged me at the gate, a brief, tight hug that said more than the 3 days of silence had. I watched her car disappear down the dirt road, and I went back inside and sat with Elena's paintings and thought about mothers and daughters and the distances between them that sometimes close and sometimes don't, and how you never know which it's going to be until you're already on the other side. It was Professor Whitfield who connected me with the person who changed the course of everything. Not directly, she wasn't a lawyer, but she knew someone who was. Her name was Diane Kessler. She was a volunteer attorney attached to the legal clinic at the university's law school, specializing in cultural heritage and preservation law. She was in her 50s, compact, with short dark hair and a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being weighed and stored and organized into a structure you couldn't yet see. When I told her everything, when I showed her the notebooks and the letters and the documentation that Elena had kept with such meticulous care, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. Elena documented everything. Every work has a record of date, technique, references, materials. The notebooks are a complete archive of her artistic production over 4 decades. The letters from Gabriel document the construction of the studio and establish the provenance of the property. This is not just art, this is documented historical heritage. And documented historical heritage has a legal protection that distant relative inheritance claims cannot easily override. The path forward, she explained, was to petition the city for formal recognition of Elena Caldwell's body of work as cultural heritage of historical significance. If approved, the works would cease to be simply disputed private property and would receive a juridical protection that made any inheritance claim substantially harder to sustain. The property itself, as the documented site of creation and preservation, would be covered by the same protection. The process took 4 months. 4 months. That number looks small on a page. It looks manageable. It looks like the kind of thing a person can endure without breaking. But 4 months of a legal battle, when you are 18 years old and living alone in a half-restored mansion and working a part-time job at a grocery store and riding a bicycle on a dirt road in the dark every morning, is not a small number. It is an eternity measured in sleepless nights and documents you don't fully understand, and hearings where men in suits use words designed to make you feel like you don't belong in the room. 4 months of hearings, of documentation so extensive that I spent entire weekends organizing papers and making copies and riding my bicycle to the bus stop, and then riding the bus to the university to meet with Diane and review filings. I learned to organize the way Elena organized, with precision and system, and the understanding that every piece of paper was a weapon and a shield at the same time. I labeled folders. I created timelines. I cross-referenced entries from the notebooks with letters from Gabriel and dates from the property records, and built a chronology of the property that was so detailed, Diane said it was better than anything her law students had ever produced. Of technical assessments by art historians and conservators that Professor Whitfield mobilized with a generosity and a determination that I still cannot adequately express gratitude for. She called in favors. She reached out to colleagues at other universities, at museums, at conservation institutes. She wrote letters of support that ran to 10 pages documenting Elena's place in the artistic history of the state, with a thoroughness that left the hearing panel with no room for doubt. One of the conservators she brought in a woman from a national museum who had spent 30 years assessing paint, composition, and canvas. Age spent an entire day in the studio examining the works with tools I had never seen before. Small lights and magnifying lenses and chemical testing strips that she handled with the care of a surgeon. When she emerged at the end of the day, she told me that the collection was not only authentic, but extraordinarily well preserved, and that the underground environment, the stable temperature, the consistent humidity, the absence of light had kept the paintings in a condition that was, in her words, almost miraculous. 4 months in which I continued living in that mansion, which was still under construction in every sense. Old Beau came most days, working steadily, patiently, the way a man works when he understands that what he's building matters beyond the immediate task. He never asked about the legal battle. He could see it on my face in the way I carried myself in the circles under my eyes. But he never asked. He just showed up, did the work, and sometimes at the end of the day, sat on the front gallery with a glass of water and said something quiet about the quality of the stone, or the way the light was hitting the facade, or how the original builders had solved a particular structural problem in a way he admired. Those small observations delivered without expectation of response were sometimes the only thing that kept me from feeling completely alone. 4 months in which I woke up early to go to the part-time job I still held, came home to a ruin that was slowly becoming less of a ruin, went down to the studio to sit with Elena's paintings for a few minutes before the light faded, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind through windows that were beginning one by one to hold glass again. The rhythm of those days was monotonous and exhausting and strangely sustaining in the way that routine sustains people who are under siege. You don't think about the siege, you think about the next task. You sweep the floor, you file the document, you pedal the bicycle, and you keep going. There was one hearing in particular that I will never forget. It was the 3rd month. Crane had brought in an appraiser who valued the collection at a number that made the room go quiet. He used that number to reinforce the argument that the sale of the property had been unconscionable, that no reasonable person would sell a property containing assets of that value for $2,400, and that the transaction Diane stood up. She was not a dramatic person. She didn't raise her voice or make sweeping gestures. She spoke the way Elena wrote, with precision and intention and a respect for the weight of words. She said that the value of the collection was not in dispute. What was in dispute was the nature of the collection itself. She placed on the table a stack of photocopied pages from Elena's notebooks marked with tabs at specific entries. She read aloud Elena's entry about refusing the gallery in 1956, the one about death by exposure, the one about the gallery owner from the capital who had come to make her an offer, and whom she had sent away with tea and a polite no. She read from Gabriel's letters about the construction of the studio, the specifications Elena had provided, the stone walls, the temperature control, the deliberate unevenness of the staircase. And then she made her argument. This collection was not an asset that had been accidentally included in a property sale. This collection was the reason the property existed. The mansion had been built specifically to house Elena Caldwell's work, designed to her specifications by a man who understood that the work and the space were inseparable. The studio was not a room in a house. It was a purpose-built preservation facility decades ahead of its time, created with the explicit intention of keeping these works intact together and protected. The Fontaine family, she continued, had no documented relationship with either Elena Caldwell or her work. No letters, no visits, no correspondence of any kind. The notebooks, which constituted a 40-year record of the artist's life and thoughts, contained not a single mention of any member of the Fontaine family. Not one. The cultural heritage designation, she concluded, was not merely appropriate. It was necessary. Because without it, a collection that a great artist had spent her entire life creating and protecting would be dispersed, sold, divided among people who had shown no interest in it until they learned it had monetary value. And that, she said, looking directly at the panel, would be exactly the kind of death by exposure that Elena Caldwell had spent her life preventing. The room was very quiet after she finished. The day the city approved the recognition, I was sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway of City Hall. Diane walked out of the hearing room with a piece of paper in her hand and a smile that didn't need words. I didn't cry. I took a deep breath. I looked at the ceiling of that hallway for a few seconds, and I thought, Elena, we did it. The cultural heritage recognition opened doors I didn't know existed. A major gallery in the state capital contacted me 2 weeks after the approval, interested in mounting a traveling exhibition with a curated selection of Elena's works. The proposal was serious, the contract was clear, and the fee for the temporary loan of the paintings was enough to pay for the complete restoration of the mansion's roof and still have money left over. A private foundation for cultural preservation reached out after that offering to fund the digitization and cataloging of the entire collection. All 134 works photographed in high resolution. Every piece of information from the notebooks recorded in a permanent database that guaranteed that even if something happened to the originals, their memory would be preserved forever. A national university invited me to participate in a seminar on heritage discovery and cultural preservation. I went to the Capitol on a bus wearing clothes that Bridget had lent me, and I spoke for 40 minutes to a room full of researchers and students about how I had found Elena Caldwell beneath the floor of a mansion that the whole town was afraid to go near. I was terrified before I walked into that room. I had never spoken to a group of adults about anything. I had never stood at a podium. I had never been the person that other people came to listen to. My hands were shaking when I opened my notes, and my voice cracked on the first sentence, and for a moment I considered stopping apologizing and walking out. But then I thought about Elena, about the Paris studios where she had been one young woman among many far from home, not sure she belonged doing the work anyway. And I thought about Gabriel, who had flown supply routes through weather that turned experienced pilots around, not because he wasn't afraid, but because the alternative to doing it was worse. I spoke for 40 minutes. I told them about the listing in the classifieds, the wrought iron gate, the trap door, the paintings on the stone walls, the notebooks in Elena's careful handwriting, the letters from a man who built a house for the woman he loved and then walked away from it to keep her safe. I didn't use academic language. I didn't try to sound like someone I wasn't. I told the story the way it happened in the order it happened. And I let it do what stories do when you don't get in their way. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then someone in the back started clapping, and then the whole room was clapping, and I stood there at that podium in Bridget's borrowed blouse and felt something I had never felt before, the sensation of being heard, not seen, heard. The difference matters. Being seen is about the surface. Being heard is about the substance. And the substance of what I had to say was not my story. It was Elena's. It was Gabriel's. I was just the person who found it and decided it was worth telling. With the resources that came in over the following months, I went back to school. I enrolled in the technical program I had dropped 2 years earlier for lack of money. I regularized the mansion, which finally received electricity, running water, and a roof that no longer let the rain in. Old Beau led the restoration. He was 75 years old and should have been retired, but when he saw the scope of what needed to be done, he just shook his head once and started showing up earlier in the morning. The restoration took almost a year. It was not a restoration that erased time. It was one that honored it. Old Beau had a philosophy about this that he articulated only once on a morning when I had suggested replacing the damaged wooden shutters on the second floor with new ones. He put down his coffee, looked at me for a moment, and said, "New wood in an old house is a lie. You fix what's there or you leave it be, but you don't pretend it's something it's not." That became the guiding principle for everything we did. We kept the stone of the facade, which Old Beau cleaned with a patience and a care that moved me to watch. He worked one section at a time using methods he had learned from his own mentor decades ago, removing the moss and the grime without damaging the surface underneath. He used a mixture of his own devising, water and white vinegar, and something else he wouldn't tell me about, applied with a soft brush in slow circular motions that looked almost meditative. He would clean a section about the size of a dinner plate, and then stand back and look at it the way Elena must have stood back from a canvas to see it from a distance. Then he'd move to the next section. At that pace, the facade alone took him 3 weeks. But when it was done, the stone that emerged was as solid and well-fitted as the day it had been laid, a warm gray that caught the light in a way that made the entire building look like it was breathing again. We kept the floorboards that were still sound, sanding them down to reveal the grain underneath the decades of dirt and damage. Some of the boards had marks on them, scratches and scuffs and stains that told their own stories, the scrape of a chair pushed back from a table, the ring left by a glass of water that someone set down and forgot about for a moment too long. We kept all of those marks. They were the handwriting of the people who had lived here. We kept the wooden staircase with its deliberately uneven steps that Gabriel had ordered built to Elena's specifications. Old Beau reinforced the structure underneath, replacing the supports that had weakened over the years, but he preserved the steps themselves. He understood without my having to explain it that the unevenness was intentional, that it meant something. He ran his hand along the worn wood and said, "These steps have been walked on by somebody who loved this house. You can feel it in the way the wood is worn, smooth in the center where the feet landed and rough at the edges where nobody stepped. Somebody went up and down these stairs the same way every day for a very long time. You don't change something like that." Every detail that could be preserved was preserved. What had to be replaced was done with materials that respected what was already there. When we needed new timber for the roof, Old Beau sourced reclaimed cypress from a demolished barn 20 miles away because he said cypress was what the original builders would have used, and anything else would be a concession he wasn't willing to make. When we needed glass for the windows, he found a glazier who could match the slight waviness of the original panes, the kind of glass that was made by hand and that gives a room a particular quality of light that modern glass doesn't produce. The roof was the biggest undertaking. 3 major collapse points plus dozens of smaller areas where water had been finding its way in for years. Old Beau brought in 2 men he trusted, younger builders he had trained himself, and the 3 of them spent 6 weeks up there stripping away what couldn't be saved and rebuilding the structure underneath. I could hear them from inside the house, the rhythmic sound of hammers and the occasional shout of instruction from Old Beau, whose voice from the roof had a different quality than his voice on the ground, louder and more commanding, as if height gave him authority that he didn't claim at ground level. The day the last section of roof was finished, I stood in the bedroom directly below it and looked up at a ceiling that was complete for the first time since I had owned the property. No sky showing through, no rain coming in, no tree growing in the corner, just a ceiling solid and whole and doing the simple, extraordinary thing that ceilings are supposed to do, keeping the inside separate from the outside. I stood there and looked up at it, and something loosened in my chest that had been tight for months. The underground studio was restored with even greater care. We kept the stone walls, we cleaned the packed earth floor, and covered it with a material that protects without altering the original surface. We installed specialized lighting that wouldn't damage the painting's tubes, that produced a warm, even glow that approximated the quality of natural light Elena had described in her notebooks as being essential for understanding color. We put in humidity control that Elena had always known the space needed even before the technology existed to provide it. The Preservation Foundation funded the climate system, a network of sensors and regulators that kept the temperature and moisture at levels that would ensure the painting's survival for generations. The staircase received a wrought iron handrail that Old Beau forged himself because he said he would not put aluminum on a staircase of that age. He spent 3 days on it, working at a portable forge he set up in the backyard, heating and bending and hammering the iron until it had the exact weight and curve he wanted. I watched him work on the 2nd day, standing at a distance, because the heat from the forge made the air shimmer for several feet in every direction. He worked the way Elena painted, with complete absorption, with a concentration so total that the rest of the world ceased to exist for him, while his hands were on the metal. When he was done, he stood at the top of the stairs and ran his hand along the rail and nodded once, and that was the most satisfied I had ever seen him. It was during the restoration that he found the hidden room. He was working on the back wall of the studio, checking the mortar between the stones, when he noticed something. A section of the wall that sounded different when he tapped it. Hollower. He tapped it again, moved his hand to the left, tapped. The sound changed. He moved to the right. It changed again. He stood back and looked at the wall with his head tilted slightly, the way a dog looks at something it doesn't understand. He called me down. I watched as he carefully removed several stones, working with a precision and a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man with hands that large. He tested each stone before removing it, tapping around the edges to make sure it wouldn't bring the adjacent stones with it, and then easing it out of its position the way you'd ease a book out of a shelf that was packed too tight. Behind the wall was a narrow space no bigger than a closet, sealed off and invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. The air that came out of it was cooler than the air in the studio, and it carried a smell that was different from anything else in the house. Not rot, not mold, something cleaner, something that had been sealed away from the processes of decay that had touched everything else. Inside there was a painting, unfinished. A landscape of the property seen from above from exactly the angle you would see it from the cockpit of an airplane. The fields, the tree line, the house, the garden, all rendered in Elena's unmistakable style but incomplete. The sky was only half painted. The light was suggested but not yet realized. The brush strokes at the edges trailed off into bare canvas as if she had stopped in the middle of a thought. Old Beau stood beside me and we both looked at it without speaking. He didn't know the full story yet. He didn't know about Gabriel or the letters or the white cloth on the garden post, but he looked at that painting and then he looked at me and he said quietly, she was trying to see something she couldn't see from where she was standing. Yes, that was exactly it. Elena had tried to paint the world through Gabriel's eyes. She had tried to see what he saw when he was up there above everything looking down at the place they had built together. And she hadn't finished. She couldn't finish, because the view from up there was not hers to complete. It belonged to someone who was gone. Beside the painting there was an envelope. Inside the envelope, a single document. A death certificate. Gabriel Hargrove. Died 1971. Mexico. 3 years after he left. 3 years of exile, 3 years of carrying the weight of everything he had walked away from, and then he was gone. Not dramatically, not heroically, just gone the way people are gone when the world they've been trying to protect keeps turning without them. Elena had known the death certificate was in her possession, which meant someone had sent it to her, or she had found out through channels I would never be able to trace. She had known that Gabriel was dead, that he would never walk back through the gate, never land his plane in the field, never come down those stairs to stand among her paintings. And she had continued to paint, alone, for almost 20 more years. She had gone down those stairs every day and worked in the space he had built for her, surrounded by the silence he had left behind, creating work that no one would ever see, filling walls that only she would look at, making art that served no purpose except the making of it. She died around 1990, alone in the mansion. The details of her death were sparse in the public records I was eventually able to find, but the notebooks told me everything I needed to know about her final years. The handwriting grew less steady, the entries grew shorter, but the discipline never wavered. She went down those stairs every day until she couldn't anymore, and the last entry in the last notebook, written in 1989 in handwriting that trembled but did not stop, was the sentence I had engraved on a wooden plaque and mounted at the entrance to the studio. The most abandoned place in the world can become the most alive. All it takes is someone who decides to stay. I did not finish Elena's painting. I thought about it. I stood in front of that unfinished canvas for hours, imagining what it would look like complete, imagining the sky filled in and the light rendered and the view from Gabriel's cockpit made whole. But the more I looked at it, the more I understood that the incompleteness was the story. The bare canvas at the edges, the brush strokes that trailed off into nothing, the sky that was only half realized, those weren't failures. They were the truest expression of what Elena felt after Gabriel died. A world that would never be fully seen again because the person who saw it from that angle was gone. I hung the painting exactly as it was, unfinished, next to the large canvas of the 2 planes in flight at sunset, with a small card explaining what it was. Elena Caldwell's attempt to see the world through the eyes of the man she loved, left incomplete because some things cannot be finished alone. Today the mansion is not just my home. The studio opens once a week for small groups of visitors. Students, researchers, ordinary people who read about the story and want to see it for themselves. Professor Whitfield organized a permanent program of guided visits that includes readings from Elena's notebooks, because she said you cannot understand the paintings without understanding the voice that created them. The first public visit happened on a Saturday morning in spring. 8 people. A mix of university students and locals who had heard about the collection through the newspaper article that ran after the heritage designation. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since the hearings. Standing at the top of the staircase watching strangers walk into Elena's space for the first time felt like a violation and a vindication at the same time. A violation because this had been her private world. The place she had specifically designed to be separate from everything public. A vindication because the alternative, leaving the paintings sealed underground forever, was a different kind of death than the death by exposure she had feared. I had thought about this for weeks before agreeing to the visits. I'd sat in the studio and argued with Elena in my head the way I sometimes did. You wanted this to be private, I told her. You refused 5 galleries. You wrote about death by exposure. And now I'm opening the door to strangers. Is this wrong? I never received an answer, of course, but I kept going back to the last entry in the last notebook. The most abandoned place in the world can become the most alive. All it takes is someone who decides to stay. Elena had written those words at the end of her life after decades of solitude, after losing Gabriel, after painting alone in a space that no one else had seen for years. And I thought maybe by the end she had changed her mind. Maybe she had realized that being unseen and being protected weren't the same thing. That you could open a door without losing what was behind it, as long as the opening was done with care. So we opened the door, carefully. The visitors came down the 8 steps one at a time. Professor Whitfield went first, reading aloud from a notebook entry as she descended, her voice filling the stone space the way the stone was built to receive it, with a resonance that made the words feel 3-dimensional. The visitors followed. Some of them stopped on the stairs and looked around with the same expression I had worn the first time I came down here. That mixture of wonder and dislocation that comes from entering a space you didn't know existed inside a world you thought you understood. One of the students, a young man with paint-stained fingers and a quiet intensity about him, stood in front of the painting of the woman at the window for almost 20 minutes. When the visit was over and the group was leaving, he came to me and said, "She knew what she was doing. The way the light falls on the figure's shoulder, that's not accidental. That's someone who studied light for decades and then used everything she knew in a single gesture. That painting says more about loneliness than any book I've ever read." I thought about that for a long time after he left, because that was exactly what Elena had done. She had taken everything she learned in Paris, everything she felt in Louisiana, everything she lost when Gabriel left, and she had put all of it into the work. Not into the world, into the work. And the work had survived. The work was here, still saying what she had wanted to say, still communicating what she had never been willing to communicate in person, still carrying the weight of her entire life in pigment and canvas, and the particular angle of light falling on a woman's shoulder. At the back of the property, where there was a small outbuilding that we restored first because it was the simplest structure, there is now an open workshop. Every Saturday morning, young people from the town, many of them from families that barely have the basics, arrive with their backpacks and spend the entire morning painting and drawing and creating. I pay for the materials with part of what the Preservation Foundation transfers monthly for the maintenance of the collection. Professor Whitfield sends undergraduate students to guide the workshops. Old Beau shows up sometimes and stands in the doorway watching the kids with the expression of a man who is seeing something that does him good. The workshop was not in any plan I made when I bought this property. It grew the way the best things grow, out of a need that I recognized only because I had felt it myself. The need to have a space where creating is not judged or evaluated or turned into a competition. Where the act of making something, anything with your hands, is treated as enough. Where a kid who has never been told they're good at anything can pick up a brush and put color on paper and have someone, anyone, look at what they made and say, "Tell me about this." There's a girl who comes every Saturday. She's 12. She has the quietest hands I've ever seen. She doesn't talk much during the workshop, doesn't participate in the group activities, doesn't share her work when the others do. She sits in the corner with her back to the wall, and she draws in a notebook that she brings from home, a cheap composition notebook with a marble cover that's already falling apart from use. She draws obsessively the way Elena must have drawn as a child, covering every available surface with images that pour out of her like water from a spring that doesn't know how to stop. One Saturday, I walked over to her corner and sat down next to her without saying anything. I didn't ask to see her notebook. I didn't offer feedback or encouragement or any of the well-meaning interventions that adults think children need. I just sat there. After a few minutes, she slid the notebook slightly toward me, not all the way, just enough that I could see the page she was working on. It was a drawing of a house, a large house with many windows surrounded by tall grass, with shapes in the yard that could have been cars. And above the house, a single airplane, small, drawn in the sky with the careful attention of someone who has looked at an airplane and thought about what it would mean to be inside it. Above everything, looking down at the world from a place where nothing on the ground could reach you. I looked at that drawing and I thought about Elena at her father's work table mixing pigments from plants. About the distance between that girl and the painter she became. About the invisible line that connects every person who has ever looked at the world and thought, I can make something of this. I didn't say anything to the girl. I just sat with her for a while. And when the workshop ended and she packed up her notebook and left with the others, I went to the studio and stood in front of the unfinished painting, and I thought, this is why. This is why you don't leave things sealed away. This is why you open the door. Because somewhere out there is a 12-year-old girl with a composition notebook, and she needs to know that what she's doing matters, that it's been done before, that it will be done again, that the line doesn't break. The 11 cars and the 2 airplanes are still there. I haven't touched them. Something in me says they should stay where they are. They are part of the story. They are proof that someone was here, loved here, and left something behind. Not because they had no choice, but because they wanted to protect something bigger than themselves. The cars have settled deeper into the earth over the years. The grass grows around them and through them and over them, and in certain seasons when everything is green and lush, you can barely see them unless you know where to look. They've become part of the landscape, part of the property's identity. Visitors sometimes walk among them, touching the rusted metal with cautious hands, asking questions that I answer when I can and leave open when I can't. Because some of the questions don't have answers. Why did he keep so many? Why didn't he sell them? Why did he leave them behind? The best answer I have is the one that the notebooks and the letters taught me, that some things matter not because of their function, but because of what they represent. A car that doesn't run is still a car. A plane that can't fly is still a plane. And a love that can't be spoken aloud is still love. Sometimes when the day is good and the late afternoon light hits the property in that specific way that only happens here, I walk out and stand near the planes for a few minutes. I don't do anything. I just stand there. The moss on the fuselage is soft and thick, the color of deep forest, and the metal underneath is cool, even on the hottest days, as if the planes still remember what it felt like to be at altitude. Where the air is cold and thin, and the world below looks like a painting someone made with enormous care, and no intention of ever showing it to anyone. I think about Gabriel in those moments. I think about what he saw from up there. The property from the air, the fields and the tree line, and the mansion he built, and the garden where Elena hung the white cloth. I think about the last time he flew over this place, the day he left, when he must have looked down and known that he was seeing it for the last time, that the view he loved more than any other was about to become a memory that he would carry with him for the rest of a life that turned out to be shorter than either of them expected. I think about the propeller blade he brought Elena, the one that threw a reflection across her cottage wall. About the two of them watching that blade of light move like the hand of a clock keeping different time. About the way some people find each other in the world and recognize something that nobody else can see, and how that recognition, that mutual understanding, is sometimes the most permanent thing that two people can build. More permanent than stone. More permanent than paint. More permanent than the mansion itself. I decided to stay. Not just in the mansion. I decided to stay in the idea that it is possible to rebuild. That it is possible to find purpose in a place where everyone else saw only ruin. That the things the world discards are sometimes exactly the things that hold what is most valuable. That a door closed in your face on a night in December can, if you don't let it define you for the rest of your life, be the beginning of something you never could have imagined from the safety of a house that was never fully yours. I was 18 years old. I had $16 in a suitcase with a broken wheel. Today I have a restored mansion, a collection of 134 works by one of the greatest painters this country never fully knew. A workshop where kids learn every Saturday that creating is an act of resistance, and the certainty that I did the right thing when I called that number shaking and said I had everything I had in the world, and that was all I could offer. I think about Gabriel sometimes, about the planes that stayed on the property because he couldn't take them without drawing attention, and that time covered with moss and rust over the decades. About the cars that represented parts of his life that were no longer there but had been. About the letter that ended with a promise to come back, and the silent certainty readable in every line that he might not be able to. And I think about Elena, about the woman who sat in an underground room for almost 40 years and painted what she saw, and what she felt, and what she imagined without an audience, without approval, without the validation that the world insists is necessary before anything can be considered real. She painted because painting was how she existed. It was her language, her breath, her way of being alive in a world that had taken away the person she loved most and offered nothing in return except silence and time and the 4 stone walls of a room that someone had built for her because he understood what she needed before she knew how to ask for it. If this story touched you in some way, if at any point while I was telling it you thought about something you lost, someone you loved, a place you left behind, a dream that seemed impossible for a long time, I want you to take one thing away from here. Sometimes the most abandoned places hold the greatest possibilities. Sometimes what looks like a ruin from the outside is exactly what you needed to find on the inside. Share this story with someone who is going through a hard time right now, with someone who needs to believe it's possible to start over, with someone who had a door closed in their face and hasn't yet found the next one that's going to open. And tell me in the comments, would you have the courage to buy an abandoned mansion with 11 rusted cars and 2 airplanes in the yard, with everything you have in your pocket, not knowing what's inside? I want to read every answer.